Black Hearts in Battersea by Joan Aiken, Chapter 4. When Simon woke next day, he heard the rain beating against his window. He opened the casement and a wild gust of wind surged about the room, so he shut it again hastily. As on the previous day, when he went downstairs, the Twite family seemed wrapped in slumber. However, his arrival at the front door coincided with the postman's knock, and a cascade of letters shot through the slot. Miss Penelope Twite instantly darted out of a nearby door, snatched up the letters, yawning, and gave Simon a hostile glance. She was wearing a faded gingham wrapper. Her hair was in curl papers, and she seemed in a very irritable humor. As she retired again, Simon heard her say snappishly, "You can do it tomorrow morning." And there was a stifled grunt and a creak of springs as if someone had jumped back into bed, slamming the door behind them. Simon went out wondering if the Twites had a particular reason for not wanting him to see the mail in case there might be a letter for Dr. Field. However, as soon as he stepped outside, he was obliged to direct all his energy to keeping himself upright and the kitten dry in the wild gusts of wind and rain that seemed threatening to knock him off his feet. He was glad that it was not far to the academy, and thankful to gain the shelter of its great portico. Here he was approached by the young man who he had seen yesterday washing socks. "Hello, my cocky," said this individual. "Old Furno's told me to watch out for you, so here's poor old Gus, eyes like cannonballs from lack of sleep, hoisted from the downy before the Chelsea cocks have left their watery nests. Particularly watery this morning, wasn't it, fathers? Ugh," he added, shuddering. 8 o'clock. To think such a time exists. There ought to be a law against it, so there should. "I'm sorry if I kept you waiting, sir," Simon apologized. "We've only just this minute got here," interposed the young man with him whom he addressed as fathers. "We've orders to take you up to the mausoleum, but I dare say you could do with a cup of coffee first." "Here, young'un, just hold that bit of tinder, will you?" Gus pulled out flint and steel and a handful of carpenter's shavings from his pouch and soon expeditiously kindled a small fire under the shelter of the portico. Meanwhile, fathers had run down to the river shore, only a stone's throw from the academy, and returned with an armful of driftwood and tarry splinters, damp to be sure, but ready to blaze up with a little encouragement. In no time a handsome fire was burning, over which fathers dexterously slung a tin paint-pot full of water. "No cooking at our lodgings," he explained, tossing in a handful of coffee. "Ever since Gus started a fire and nearly burnt the landlady in her bed, so we have breakfast here." Pity I didn't succeed in frizzling the old skinflint," Gus remarked morosely, dropping 3 eggs into the coffee pot. 7 minutes for mine, fathers. I fancy 'em hard. Hey, what's your name? Have you any bread on you?" "Yes, sir." Simon had purchased a long loaf of sausage on the way to Chelsea. He was delighted to contribute to the meal. "Ah, that's devilish good," exclaimed Gus, his eyes lighting up. "I haven't had my grinders and a bit of solid prog for 3 days, and just about enough of nibbling old Mrs. Grobb's parsley and spring onions from her window boxes. But you mustn't call us, sir, young'un. We're only poor students, same as yourself. This is Democracy Hall, this is." While he waited for his egg to boil, he pulled a cake of soap from his pocket, held it out in the rain a moment, rubbed up a lather on his jaw, and then, with a palette knife, which he drew from his painter's satchel, proceeded calmly to shave, using the lid of the coffee tin as a mirror. By the time he had done, fathers, who had been timing the eggs with a large turnip watch, pronounced them ready. Simon, who was wet and chilled, found himself very glad of the drink of hot coffee. He noticed that his new friends, though they were plainly very hungry, showed great delicacy in eating only sparingly of his bread and sausage. He pressed more on them. "No, thank ye, young'un," said Fotheringham. "You'll be wanting it yourself come dinner time. Sausages don't grow on trees in London, you know, and they aren't giving away any half-crowns yet, that I've heard. Come along now, and I'll show you the way to the mausoleum." This proved to be an enormous room containing a regular forest of statues. Sitting, standing, lying in marble, metal, and granite, they seemed as if they had sprouted from the floor like mustard and cress. "Old Furno's always makes you start by drawing these," Gus explained. "All of them?" Simon looked round in alarm. Bless you, no. Depends if he likes you, then he moves you on quick enough. You'll be all right. Anyone could tell he'd taken quite a shine to you. Thank you, Simon called after them as they left. Presently, Dr. Furneaux came bustling in, directed Simon to draw a statue of a lady who appeared to be wearing nothing but a fishnet, uttered words of instruction and encouragement in his ear, and then surged around the room, praising, scolding, and exhorting the other students. The day passed quickly. As usual, when Simon drew, he hardly noticed the passage of time. The kitten foraged among the statues and received a share of bread and sausage at dinner time. At last the light began to fade, and Simon rubbed his stiff hands. Enough, enough now, boy, exclaimed Dr. Furneaux, materializing beside him like a whiskey ghost in the dusk. The others, they all pack up and finish long ago. To draw in the dark is to ruin the eyes. Away with you and come back. Maintenant, in good time tomorrow morning. He peered at Simon's drawings and said, Good boy, and bustled away. Simon went off to Mr. Cobb's yard, where he worked hard at splicing shafts for a couple of hours. Mr. Cobb himself was in the smithy, superintending the shoeing of an excitable little bay mare. Presently he came out, rubbing the sweat off his brow. Proper handful she be, he said with a grin. Artful as a crucible load of monkeys. She come in a hobbling from a shoe cast, and now she've lamed the young fellow as brought her, kicked him on the kneecap, and he's limping like a tinker's moke. He allers was an unhandy chap, was my wife's cousin Jem. Another explosion of whinnies came from the forge. The little mare danced out, making circles around the smith, who was leading her. Another man followed, limping and cursing. Here, Jem boy, you best go up to Flue's. Ask her to rub some liniment on that knee, Mr. Cobb said. Knee like that goes proud on you. You'll be lame for months, I dare say his grace the Duke don't mind waiting for the mare. 'Tain't his grace, Jem said sulkily. It's for my young Lord Whippersnapper. Nothing would please his fancy but to go riding by torchlight in the park, and no other mount in the stable but this one would do for him to set his lordly seat on. Dang me, was there ever such a proffer when 'twas found when 'twas found she'd a shoe loose. Now it would serve, but I must take and have her shod this instant, and he's waiting for her now. He moved to take the mare's bridle, limped again heavily, and let out an involuntary groan. You bide here along, Jem boy, said Mr. Cobb concernedly. One of the others can take the filly back. I'll go, said Simon instantly, putting a finished shaft with a pile of others. Where shall I take her? Ah, there's me boy. 'Twon't take you but a minute. Only a step from here it be. Duke of Battersea's stables. Go in the back way, through the tunnel. Ask for Mr. Waters. He's the head groom. Give him my compliments. And say my Floss is putting a tar poultice on Jem's knee, and he'll be right as rain before Goose Friday. Is the boy trustworthy? Jem asked, shooting a doubtful glance at Simon. He won't take the filly over to Smithfield and sell her for cat's meat. Trustworthy as me old mother, said Mr. Cobb heavily. Come on now, Jem boy. What you need is a drop of organ grinder's oil. He helped the limping Jem up the stairs, shouting for Flossie to get out the tar in a large saucepan. Simon tucked the kitten into his jacket, took the mare's bridle from the smith, led her out of the gate and along the river bank to Chelsea Bridge. Beyond, across the river, was the noble pile of Battersea Castle. Gus had pointed out the castle that morning while they were breakfasting. Simon had been delighted to learn that the place where his friend Sophie lived was so near, and had been planning to go to the servants' entrance as soon as possible and ask to see her. Returning the mare offered an excellent opportunity, and he seized it at once. He paused a moment, gazing in awe at the huge mass of buildings composing the castle. It stood close to the river on either side, and to the rear stretched the extensive park and gardens, filled with splendid trees, fountains, and belts of brilliant flowers in shades of pink, crimson, or scarlet. The castle itself was built of pink granite, and enclosed completely a smaller, older building, which the present Duke's father had considered too insignificant for his town residence. The new castle had taken 40 years to build, 3 architects, and hundreds of men had worked day and night, and the old Duke had personally selected every block of sunset-colored stone that went into its construction. "I want it to look like a great half-opened rose," he declared to the architects, who were fired with enthusiasm by this romantic fancy. It was begun as a wedding present to the Duke's wife, whose name was Rosamond, but unfortunately she died some 9 years before it was completed. "Never mind, it will do for her memorial instead," said the grief-stricken but practical widower. The work went on. At last the final block was laid in place. The Duke, by now very old, went out in his barouche and drove slowly along the opposite river bank to consider the effect. He paused midway for a long time, then gave his opinion. "It looks like a cod cutlet covered in shrimp sauce," he said, drove home, took to his bed, and died. But his son, the fifth and present Duke, who had been born and brought up in the castle, lived in it contentedly enough, and was only heard to utter one complaint about it. "It's too dry," he said. "Not enough mildew." For the fifth Duke was a keen natural scientist, and molds were one of his passions. At this time of day, the great pink structure was lit by a circle of blazing gas flambeaux, which vied with the smoky rose color of the London sunset and were reflected in the river below. Glancing about him, Simon noticed a sign at the foot of the bridge. Battersea Castle, tradesmen and servants, turn left. Obediently he turned and found the entrance to a large tunnel which ran under the river. The mare went forward contentedly into it with ears pricked. Plainly she knew her way home, and was not startled by the booming echoes which her hoof-beats called out from the curving walls. The tunnel was not dark, for gas lamps hung at regular intervals from the roof, but it was rather damp. Rain from the morning storm had collected on the floor in large pools. Toward the middle, one of these extended for some 20 feet. Simon, leading the mare, splashed unconcernedly through. Having lived in the woods for years, he was not worried by a trifle like wet feet. But he saw a girl some way ahead of him pause at the edge of a large puddle. Then a man who had been walking some paces behind her overtook her and picked her up to carry her through. When the man was well into the middle of the pool, however, he evidently began to tickle the girl, for she screamed and struggled. Simon, approaching, heard him say, "You'd best promise to come with me to the bear baiting on Saturday, or I'll drop you. 1, 2, 3. "I'll do no such thing!" exclaimed the girl with spirit. "You know I can't abide the bear baiting." "Then I'll drop you." "Oh!" exclaimed the girl furiously. "How I'd box your ears if my hands weren't full of grapes and thistles. Will you stop being